In the summer of 1943, when the American submarine force was already deep into its most aggressive phase of the Pacific War, Joseph Francis Enright received his first command. He was 31 years old, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, technically competent, methodical, and regarded as reliable rather than brilliant. His assignment was the fleet submarine USS Dace, SS-247, a Gato-class boat operating from Pearl Harbor at a time when U.S. submarines were finally beginning to impose sustained pressure on Japanese sea communications. The expectations were clear and unspoken: patrol aggressively, close with the enemy, and exploit fleeting opportunities, even at personal and material risk. Enright's first war patrol took Dace into the waters south of Japan, an area heavily patrolled by enemy escorts, but also traversed by high-value units moving between home ports and forward bases. In October 1943, during daylight hours, Dace made contact with a large Japanese task group. Visual identification and periscope observations confirmed the presence of the aircraft carrier Shokaku, one of the most important fleet carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, already a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Midway. The tactical situation was imperfect but promising. Range was long, the angle was not ideal, yet the target's value outweighed almost any risk. At this point, Enright made a decision that would define his reputation for the next year. Acting strictly in accordance with pre-war doctrine, he attempted to maneuver Dace into a textbook firing position rather than accept a marginal shot. Course and speed were adjusted to improve attack geometry, but the maneuver cost time. The Japanese formation altered course, destroyer sectors tightened their arcs, and the narrow window that existed began to close. As minutes passed, the relative motion solution degraded instead of improving. Eventually, Enright concluded that the probability of success no longer justified exposure and broke off the attack entirely, allowing Shokaku to pass unharmed. Within the U.S. submarine force, the patrol was judged unsuccessful, not because Enright had violated orders, but because he had followed them too rigidly. By 1943, experienced commanders were expected to bend doctrine when circumstances demanded it. A distant, imperfect shot at a fleet carrier was considered preferable to no shot at all. Enright himself understood this after the fact. His post-patrol reports were precise, technically sound, and honest, but they could not erase the central conclusion: he had encountered a decisive opportunity and failed to act decisively. That realization would not fade when Dace returned to port. It would follow Enright into the next phase of his career, where the margin for error would be far smaller and the cost of hesitation far higher. The judgment on Dace's patrol was delivered without ceremony. In late 1943, within days of Enright's return to Pearl Harbor, the assessment moved up the command chain and reached Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific. Lockwood did not question Enright's integrity, technical knowledge, or discipline. What concerned him was something more fundamental: the inability to convert contact into destruction. In a submarine war increasingly defined by initiative and aggression, failure to attack a fleet carrier when contact had been established was viewed as a disqualifying weakness. Lockwood's decision was swift and final. Enright was relieved of command of USS Dace. There was no public reprimand, no formal court of inquiry, and no official condemnation entered into the record. Within the submarine force, such administrative silence was more damaging than open criticism. Command relief spoke for itself. Enright was reassigned ashore to staff duties, a transfer that in the wartime submarine service carried a clear implication. Submarine command was not rotational. Officers who lost a boat rarely received another. The force was small, casualties were high, and opportunities were reserved for men who had already demonstrated a willingness to take decisive risks under pressure. The institutional culture of the U.S. submarine arm in 1943 left little room for rehabilitation. Combat experience was valued above seniority, and measured caution was increasingly interpreted as hesitation. The submarine campaign had moved beyond theoretical doctrine into a phase where results alone justified command. Sinkings mattered more than clean patrol reports. In that environment, an officer ashore was an officer sidelined. For many, staff assignment marked the quiet end of a combat career. Enright understood this reality fully. His error, as he later analyzed it, was not a failure of navigation, gunnery, or situational awareness. It was methodological. He had treated doctrine as a constraint rather than a tool. Pre-war submarine tactics emphasized ideal firing solutions, conservative exposure, and disengagement when conditions deteriorated. Wartime conditions demanded the opposite: rapid commitment, acceptance of imperfect geometry, and exploitation of fleeting chances before escorts could react. Enright had followed the book in a war that no longer rewarded those who did. For months, his name disappeared from patrol rosters. Younger officers with fewer years of service but more aggressive reputations went to sea instead. Enright remained ashore, watching boats depart and return, absorbing lessons from others' success without the opportunity to apply them himself. In the submarine force, time ashore was usually time lost forever. Yet beneath that apparent finality, a different process was underway, one that depended less on official evaluations than on whether a commander could convincingly argue that he had truly understood why he failed. That question, whether Enright had learned the correct lesson, had not yet been answered, and its resolution would determine whether his career ended quietly on land or returned, improbably, to the sea.
By mid-1944, Joseph Enright's career appeared settled into quiet obscurity. He worked efficiently on staff, produced accurate analyses, and avoided drawing attention to himself, yet the absence of a command weighed heavily. Within the U.S. submarine force, however, manpower pressures and combat losses were forcing difficult reassessments. Experienced officers were scarce, and Vice Admiral Lockwood, despite his reputation for decisiveness, was not immune to reconsidering earlier judgments when evidence justified it. Enright requested a direct meeting, an unusual step for an officer already relieved of command, but Lockwood agreed. The conversation was brief and unsentimental. Enright did not defend his actions aboard Dace in tactical terms. He did not argue probability tables or firing angles. Instead, he acknowledged that his failure had been conceptual. He stated plainly that he had misunderstood the nature of command in a submarine war, where fleeting opportunity mattered more than doctrinal purity, and where imperfect attacks were often the only attacks available. Lockwood listened without interruption. What mattered to him was not regret, but whether Enright had internalized the operational logic that governed successful patrols in 1944 rather than 1941. At the end of the meeting, Lockwood offered no assurances, only a conditional decision. Enright would be given another boat, and there would be no margin for hesitation. The assignment was USS Archerfish, SS-311, a Balao-class submarine newly arrived in the Pacific. Technically, it was an improvement over Dace: greater test depth, stronger pressure hull, improved endurance, and reliable surface search radar. The boat was sound, but the crew was inexperienced. Many of the men were on their first war patrol, trained rapidly to replace losses sustained in 1943 and early 1944. Expectations were limited. Archerfish was not earmarked for decisive operations, only for routine patrol duty along Japanese transit routes. For Enright, the new command represented both opportunity and constraint. There would be no tolerance for conservative decision-making, yet no institutional patience for a second failure. From the moment he took Archerfish to sea, his approach changed. Attack problems were rehearsed with an emphasis on speed rather than elegance. Radar contacts were treated as opportunities, not problems to be refined. Enright focused less on theoretical firing solutions and more on relative motion, enemy behavior, and timing. Doctrine was no longer a rulebook, but a reference point to be discarded when conditions demanded it. As Archerfish moved toward its assigned patrol area in late November 1944, Enright understood the situation precisely. He commanded a capable submarine with an untested crew and a reputation already damaged beyond repair if he failed again. Whatever opportunity presented itself would have to be taken immediately, without hesitation or retreat. The Pacific night ahead offered no indication of what was coming, only the certainty that when contact occurred, there would be no second reconsideration.
Shortly before midnight, on 28 November 1944, USS Archerfish was running on the surface in the Philippine Sea, east of Honshu, in darkness broken only by low cloud and scattered stars. Sea conditions were moderate, visibility poor, and the area was considered secondary, far from the heavily trafficked convoy routes. At 22:48, the radar operator reported a large contact bearing to the northwest, initially indistinct but rapidly resolving into a high-speed target accompanied by smaller escorts. Radar range and return strength suggested a ship far larger than any merchantman, moving at a sustained speed uncommon for transports. Enright ordered Archerfish to flank speed. The submarine's 4 diesel engines were pushed well beyond economical limits, driving the boat at over 20 knots. Fuel consumption became irrelevant. Contact retention mattered more. Radar tracking revealed a zigzag pattern typical of a capital ship under escort, with course changes executed at regular intervals. Enright calculated the rhythm of these maneuvers and began projecting interception points rather than attempting to follow directly astern. Any miscalculation would widen the gap irreversibly. Unlike standard doctrine, Enright chose to remain surfaced. Submerged speed would have guaranteed loss of contact. The risk was extreme. A surfaced submarine running at flank speed was vulnerable to radar-equipped escorts and aircraft. Yet radar conditions favored Archerfish. Sea clutter and land interference reduced the enemy's detection capability, while Archerfish's own surface search radar maintained a stable track. The engines strained continuously, temperatures climbing, vibration increasing, but Enright did not reduce speed. He accepted the mechanical risk as secondary to positional advantage. Over the next several hours, Enright refined the geometry of the chase. He noted the relationship between zigzag intervals and speed changes, calculating not where the target was, but where it would be when Archerfish could finally dive ahead of its track. The margin for error was minimal. A premature dive would place the submarine too far astern. A delayed dive would eliminate the firing solution entirely. Every decision depended on precise timing and the assumption that the enemy would maintain its current pattern. By the early hours of 29 November, Archerfish had closed the distance sufficiently to attempt interception. The target loomed massive even on radar, its size now undeniable. Enright ordered the crew to prepare for submergence. The boat angled across the projected path of the enemy formation, positioning itself not for pursuit, but for a single decisive intercept. In the control room, calculations were checked and rechecked, knowing that once the dive commenced, there would be no opportunity to adjust the overall geometry. The entire attack would depend on whether Enright's reading of the night, of speed, timing, and intent was correct. At 03:17 on 29 November 1944, Enright ordered Archerfish to dive. The submarine slid beneath the surface at a calculated point ahead of the enemy's projected track, settling at periscope depth as the control room shifted from pursuit to attack. Sound reports confirmed multiple escorts screening the formation, but their spacing reflected confidence rather than alertness. Enright chose to minimize exposure time. Periscope observations were brief and deliberate, limited to essential bearings and mast height estimates, avoiding prolonged visibility that could betray the boat's position. As the target emerged from the darkness, its scale became unmistakable. The hull length exceeded expectations, and the freeboard suggested a displacement far greater than any carrier Enright had previously encountered. Speed remained high, approximately 20 knots, and the zigzag pattern continued with mechanical regularity. Enright adjusted the firing solution continuously, rejecting standard recommendations that favored deeper torpedo runs and staggered spreads. Against a ship of this size, he concluded that doctrinal depth settings risked underrunning critical compartments. He selected a shallow running depth set to strike the hull near the armored belt rather than beneath it, and made the decisive choice to fire all forward tubes in a single salvo. Doctrine emphasized conservation and sequential firing to correct errors. Enright dismissed this approach. The geometry of the intercept provided a broadside angle that would not improve with delay, and any hesitation would invite evasive action by the escorts. The attack would succeed or fail in one moment. At 03:51, Enright gave the order to fire. 6 torpedoes left the bow in rapid succession, their wakes briefly visible before vanishing into darkness. Immediately, Archerfish went deep. The boat descended rapidly to maximum depth, engines reduced, silence enforced. Seconds stretched as the crew waited, listening through the hull for confirmation. Then the detonations came, spaced but unmistakable, heavy impacts transmitted through water and steel. Sound operators reported multiple hits along the starboard side of the target. Enright did not linger. He ordered further descent and course changes to evade counterattack, anticipating an immediate and violent response. Depth charges followed, but they were scattered and poorly coordinated, suggesting confusion rather than organized pursuit. The escorts had not expected a submarine attack so close to the coast, nor against a ship presumed secure. As Archerfish slipped away into deeper water, Enright understood that the decisions he had made, rejecting doctrine, accepting risk, committing fully, had achieved what restraint never could. The magnitude of the result, however, was still unknown, and confirmation would only come with daylight. The target struck during the early hours of 29 November 1944 was the aircraft carrier Shinano, a ship whose true nature was unknown to Enright at the time of the attack. Shinano had begun life as the third hull of the Yamato-class battleships, laid down in 1940, but after the loss of 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway, she was converted during construction into a carrier of unprecedented size. With a full load displacement exceeding 65,000 tons, she became the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Yet when she sailed from Yokosuka toward Kure on her maiden voyage, she was incomplete, inadequately tested, and rushed into service under strategic pressure. Shinano's internal condition proved decisive. Many watertight compartments had not been pressure tested, damage control teams were insufficiently trained, and critical internal fittings remained temporary. When Archerfish's torpedoes struck along the starboard side, they did not cause immediate catastrophic flooding. Instead, they triggered progressive structural failures. Water spread through poorly sealed compartments, electrical systems failed, and counter-flooding orders were issued too late and without coordination. The ship's list increased steadily through the morning hours. Japanese escort commanders initially believed Shinano could be saved. Tugs were summoned, speed was reduced, and damage control efforts continued for several hours. But as flooding worsened, the carrier's stability margin vanished. At approximately 10:57 on 29 November, Shinano capsized and sank, taking more than 1,400 crewmen with her. The escorts rescued survivors, but could not prevent the loss. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the sinking was a profound shock, concealed from the public and officially minimized, yet internally recognized as an irreversible failure of wartime shipbuilding under desperation. Post-war analysis confirmed the scale of the event. American intelligence initially underestimated Shinano's tonnage, but later Japanese records established her true size and origin. The sinking redefined assumptions about submarine lethality against capital ships and demonstrated that even the largest vessels were vulnerable when construction, training, and doctrine failed to align. For Enright, The outcome closed the arc of his career. The officer once removed for excessive caution had destroyed the greatest warship ever lost to a submarine by rejecting caution entirely. Joseph Francis Enright finished the war decorated and vindicated, his earlier failure reinterpreted not as incompetence, but as an incomplete understanding corrected under pressure. The sinking of Shinano remains a singular event in naval history, not because of spectacle, but because it illustrated a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Size offers no immunity, and decisive command, exercised at the correct moment, can overturn even the heaviest concentration of steel and ambition.